In the heart of a bustling metropolis, there stood a towering building, housing one of the city's most successful corporations. Within its glass walls, hundreds of employees worked tirelessly. But none were more dedicated than David. A man in his early 30s, David had climbed the corporate ladder through sheer hard work and determination. Known for his attention to detail and unwavering commitment, he had become a trusted member of the team, often praised by his colleagues and superiors alike. He was a man of integrity, a rare quality in the cutthroat world of business. David's life outside the office was equally fulfilling. He was married to Emily, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her kindness. Emily was the light of David's life, the one who kept him grounded amid the pressures of his demanding job. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, love, and an unbreakable bond that had only strengthened over the years. To David, Emily was not just his wife. She was his confidant, his best friend, and the person he could always rely on. Emily, with her warm smile and compassionate nature, was adored by everyone who met her. She had an effortless grace that drew people to her, making her a favorite at social gatherings. Despite her beauty, she remained humble and down to earth, never letting the admiration of others go to her head. She was deeply in love with David and was proud of the man he had become. Together, they were the picture of happiness, a couple who seemed to have it all. At the helm of the corporation was Mr. Graham, the CEO. He was a man who commanded respect wherever he went, tall, with a sharp suit and an air of authority. Mr. Graham was the epitome of success. He had built the company from the ground up, and his hard work had paid off. Under his leadership, the company had grown exponentially, and Mr. Graham had become one of the most powerful men in the industry. But with power came a sense of entitlement, and Mr. Graham was used to getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. David had always admired Mr. Graham. To him, Mr. Graham was more than just a boss. He was a mentor, someone who had recognized his potential and given him opportunities to grow. David had worked closely with Mr. Graham on numerous projects, and over time, a professional relationship had developed into a mutual respect. David never questioned Mr. Graham's decisions and was always eager to prove himself, striving to meet the high standards set by his boss. However, David was unaware of a side of Mr. Graham that was not often seen. Beneath the polished exterior and the aura of success was a man driven by ambition and a desire for control. Mr. Graham was a man who had everything: wealth, power, and influence. But there was one thing he didn't have: someone who truly cared for him. Despite all his accomplishments, Mr. Graham was a lonely man. And this loneliness had begun to eat away at him, making him vulnerable to desires that he would have otherwise suppressed. It was in this state of mind that Mr. Graham first laid eyes on Emily. It was at an office party, one of the many events that Mr. Graham hosted to celebrate the company's successes. The party was held at a luxurious venue, with champagne flowing and laughter filling the air. Employees mingled, celebrating another profitable quarter, while Mr. Graham watched over them. The proud leader of a thriving empire, David had brought Emily to the party, eager to introduce her to his colleagues and show her the world he was so proud of. As they entered the room, all eyes were on them. Emily's presence was magnetic. She had a way of lighting up any room she walked into. She moved gracefully, smiling and chatting with David's co-workers, making a lasting impression on everyone she met. But it was Mr. Graham who was most captivated by her. From the moment she entered the room, he couldn't take his eyes off her. There was something about Emily that stirred feelings within him that he hadn't felt in a long time. As he watched her, a thought crossed his mind, a thought that he quickly dismissed, but that lingered nonetheless. How could someone like her be with someone like David? He was just an employee, after all, while Mr. Graham was the CEO, a man of power and influence. Surely he could offer her more, a life of luxury and comfort that David could never provide. As the evening went on, Mr. Graham found himself drawn to Emily, making his way through the crowd to introduce himself. When he finally stood before her, he was struck by how effortlessly beautiful she was up close. She greeted him with the same warm smile she had given everyone else, unaware of the effect she was having on him. "Emily," he said, taking her hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you. David speaks so highly of you." "Thank you, Mr. Graham," she replied politely. "David has nothing but great things to say about you as well. He's very proud to work for you." Their conversation was brief, but it was enough to leave a lasting impression on Mr. Graham. As the night went on, he found himself watching her from across the room, unable to shake the feeling that he needed to see her again. And so, the seed of temptation was planted, setting in motion a chain of events that would change all of their lives forever. The days that followed the office party were busy ones for David. He was deep into a major project that required all of his attention. Little did he know, however, that his boss's mind was elsewhere. Mr. Graham couldn't stop thinking about Emily. Her image lingered in his thoughts, distracting him during meetings and haunting him late at night when he was alone in his sprawling penthouse. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, as though something essential was missing from his life. Driven by a growing obsession, Mr. Graham began to find excuses to see Emily again. He organized more company events and made sure David and Emily were invited. Each time, he would subtly position himself near her, engaging her in conversation, complimenting her, and making sure she felt welcomed. To David, it seemed like his boss was just being friendly, taking an interest in his personal life. But to Mr. Graham, it was a calculated move. During these gatherings, Mr. Graham would often find himself alone with Emily. Even if just for a moment, he would compliment her, telling her how remarkable she was, how David was lucky to have her. Emily, always polite, would thank him, but she never gave his words much thought. To her, Mr. Graham was simply her husband's boss, and she had no reason to suspect anything more. But Mr. Graham's feelings only grew stronger. He found himself daydreaming about her, imagining what it would be like to have her by his side. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that he could offer her a better life. He was a man of wealth and power, capable of giving her anything she desired. Surely she would see that she deserved more than what David could provide. As his obsession deepened, Mr. Graham began to push the boundaries of what was appropriate. He started finding reasons to have David stay late at work, hoping that Emily would come to the office to bring him dinner or pick him up. On those occasions, Mr. Graham would seize the opportunity to strike up a conversation with her, offering to show her around the office or inviting her to join him for a drink while David finished up. One evening, after a long day, Mr. Graham invited David and Emily to join him for dinner at an exclusive restaurant. David, eager to make a good impression and unaware of his boss's intentions, agreed. The evening started off well enough, with polite conversation and laughter, but as the night wore on, Mr. Graham's comments became more personal. He praised Emily excessively, telling her how she was a rare find, how she had a presence that lit up the room. Emily, feeling uncomfortable, tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but Mr. Graham was relentless. He talked about his own life, how lonely it could be at the top, how he had everything except someone to share it with. David, oblivious to the underlying meaning, simply nodded along, thinking his boss was making small talk. But Emily sensed something was off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something in the way Mr. Graham looked at her, something that made her uneasy. She decided to cut the evening short, thanking Mr. Graham for the dinner and suggesting they head home. David agreed, and the two left the restaurant, leaving Mr. Graham to dwell on his growing obsession. As they drove home, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Graham's attention was more than just professional interest. She wondered if David had noticed anything, but when she glanced at him, he seemed completely unaware. Not wanting to worry him, she kept her thoughts to herself, hoping that it was all just in her imagination. But it wasn't. Mr. Graham's feelings for Emily were real, and they were growing stronger by the day. He began to imagine a future with her, one where she was by his side, enjoying the luxuries his wealth could provide. He became more determined to make her see that she deserved more than what David could offer. And so, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. Mr. Graham's obsession had taken root, and there was no turning back. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and he was determined to have Emily, no matter the cost. Graham's obsession with Emily only intensified. He began to devise a plan to win her over, convinced that he could make her see that she belonged with him. It was after a lavish charity gala, an event filled with the city's elite, that he decided to make his move. The gala had been a success, and as the evening came to a close, Mr. Graham found an opportunity to be alone with Emily. The two were standing on a balcony overlooking the city, the twinkling lights below, creating a romantic backdrop. Emily had come to the gala with David, but he had been called away to discuss a business matter with a client, leaving her alone with Mr. Graham. Seizing the moment, Mr. Graham turned to Emily, his expression serious. "Emily," he began, his voice soft but firm. "There's something I need to tell you." Emily, sensing the gravity in his tone, looked up at him, curious but cautious. "What is it, Mr. Graham?" He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I can't hide it any longer. Emily, I'm in love with you." Emily's eyes widened in shock. This was the last thing she had expected to hear. "Mr. Graham, But he cut her off, desperate to make her understand. "Emily, you deserve so much more than what David can give you. I can give you everything: wealth, power, security. You could have a life most people only dream of. Just leave David and be with me." Emily was stunned, her mind racing. She had always respected Mr. Graham, admired his success and leadership, but she had never imagined that he would feel this way about her. The idea of leaving David was unthinkable. She loved her husband deeply, and no amount of money or power could ever make her betray him. "Mr. Graham," she said, finding her voice, "I'm flattered, but I love David. I've loved him since the day we met, and nothing will ever change that. I'm sorry, but I can't be with you." Mr. Graham was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. He had never been rejected before, never had anyone tell him no. The realization that Emily would never be his was a bitter pill to swallow. But even as he stood there, trying to come to terms with her rejection, another thought crossed his mind. If he couldn't have her, then he would make David pay. In the days that followed, Mr. Graham's behavior towards David changed drastically. He became more critical, finding fault with everything David did. Projects that would have once earned David praise were now met with harsh criticism. Meetings that used to be collaborative turned into tense confrontations. David, who had always been confident in his work, began to feel the pressure. He couldn't understand what had changed. Why was Mr. Graham suddenly so hard on him? What had he done wrong? At home, Emily noticed the strain David was under. He came home late, exhausted and frustrated, his usual optimism replaced by doubt. She wanted to tell him about Mr. Graham's confession, to warn him that his boss's behavior was personal, but she didn't know how. She was afraid that it would only make things worse, but the tension at work continued to build. David found himself staying later and later, trying to meet Mr. Graham's impossible standards. His confidence was shattered, and he began to question his abilities. Emily could see the toll it was taking on him, and she knew she had to do something. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Emily decided to confront Mr. Graham directly. She went to his office one afternoon, determined to put an end to his advances and to stop him from tormenting David. When she entered his office, Mr. Graham was surprised to see her, but he quickly regained his composure, a sly smile playing on his lips. "Emily," he said smoothly, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" She didn't waste any time. "Mr. Graham, this needs to stop. Your feelings for me are inappropriate, and they're affecting David's work. You're punishing him for something that's not his fault, and it's not fair." Mr. Graham's smile faded. "I'm not punishing David," he said defensively. "I'm simply holding him to a higher standard." "No," Emily replied firmly. "You're taking out your frustrations on him because I won't leave him. It's not right, and it's not professional." If you care about me at all, you'll stop this. You'll leave us alone and let David do his job without interference." Mr. Graham looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, though there was a coldness in his eyes. "Very well, Emily, I'll respect your wishes. But remember this, I could have given you the world." With that, Emily left his office, relieved that she had finally stood up to him, but still uneasy about what the future would hold. Emily left Mr. Graham's office with a mix of relief and anxiety. She had stood up to him, made her feelings clear, and demanded that he stop interfering in their lives. But she knew that Mr. Graham was not a man to easily let things go. His power and influence were vast, and she worried about the potential consequences of their confrontation. She couldn't help but feel a lingering unease, a sense that this wasn't over yet. That evening, when David came home, Emily noticed that he was quieter than usual, his face lined with stress. He sat down at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped, and ran a hand through his hair. Emily's heart ached for him. She knew how much he valued his job, how much pride he took in his work, and it pained her to see him so defeated. "David," she said gently, sitting down beside him, "we need to talk." David looked at her, his eyes filled with exhaustion. "What is it, Emily? Is something wrong?" Emily took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. She had been dreading this moment, but she knew it was necessary. "David, there's something I need to tell you. It's about Mr. Graham." David's expression changed instantly, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "What about him?" Emily hesitated for a moment before speaking. "A few weeks ago, at the charity gala, Mr. Graham, he confessed something to me. He told me that he's in love with me, and he asked me to leave you and be with him." David stared at her in shock, unable to process what he was hearing. "He what?" "I told him no, of course," Emily continued, her voice steady. "I told him that I love you and that I would never leave you. But ever since then, he's been making your life at work difficult, and I think it's because of what happened." David was silent, his mind racing. Everything suddenly made sense. The sudden criticism, the impossible demands, the change in Mr. Graham's behavior. It wasn't about his work at all. It was personal. His boss was punishing him because of his feelings for Emily. But then something else occurred to David, something that Emily didn't know. He had suspected that something was off for a while. He had noticed the way Mr. Graham looked at Emily, the way he seemed to go out of his way to spend time with her. And then there was the conversation he had overheard at the gala. He hadn't heard everything, but he had caught enough to know that Mr. Graham had feelings for his wife. David looked at Emily, his expression softening. "Emily, I've known for a while." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. "You have?" David nodded. "I overheard part of your conversation at the gala. I didn't hear everything, but I heard enough to know that he was interested in you. I didn't say anything because I trust you, and I knew you would never do anything to hurt me. But now, I see that I should have said something sooner. I should have warned you." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been so worried about how David would react, but now that he knew, she felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. "I'm so sorry, David. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't want to worry you." David reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "It's okay, Emily. We're in this together, and now that I know the truth, I'm going to put an end to this." The next day, David went to work with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that he couldn't continue working under Mr. Graham's oppressive rule, but he also knew that confronting him head-on could have serious consequences. He needed to be strategic, to find a way to protect himself and Emily while also putting an end to Mr. Graham's advances. After a long day of meetings and deadlines, David finally decided it was time to confront Mr. Graham. But instead of going into the meeting with anger, he went in with a plan. He knew that Mr. Graham was a man who valued his reputation above all else, and he planned to use that to his advantage. When he entered Mr. Graham's office, his boss looked up from his desk, surprised to see him. "David, what can I do for you?" David took a deep breath and spoke calmly. "Mr. Graham, I think it's time we had an honest conversation." Mr. Graham raised an eyebrow, curious but wary. "Oh, and what would that be about?" "It's about Emily," David said, getting straight to the point. "I know how you feel about her, and I know that you've been making my life at work difficult because of it. But I'm here to tell you that it needs to stop." Mr. Graham's expression hardened, but David didn't back down. "I'm not here to threaten you, but I want you to understand that if you continue to interfere in our lives, I'll have no choice but to take action. I have a family to protect, and I won't let anyone come between us." There was a tense silence in the room as Mr. Graham considered David's words. He could see that David was serious, that he wasn't afraid to stand up to him. And for the first time, Mr. Graham realized that he had underestimated his employee. Finally, Mr. Graham sighed and leaned back in his chair. "David, I understand where you're coming from. I admit that I let my feelings get the better of me, and for that, I apologize. You're a valuable member of this company, and I don't want to lose you. I'll back off, and you have my word that this will never happen again." David nodded, relieved that the conversation had gone better than he had expected. "Thank you, Mr. Graham. I appreciate your understanding." As David left the office, he felt a sense of closure. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was confident that he and Emily would come out stronger on the other side. He had stood up for what was right, and he had protected the one thing that mattered most to him, his family. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal for David and Emily. Mr. Graham kept his word, and David's work life improved significantly. The tension that had once plagued their relationship was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of trust and commitment. David and Emily were closer than ever, their bond strengthened by the challenges they had faced together. But the story didn't end there. Unbeknownst to David and Emily, Mr. Graham's obsession hadn't completely faded. He had promised to back off, and for the most part, he had. But the feelings he had developed for Emily still lingered in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of what he had lost. One day, several months after the confrontation, Mr. Graham received a call from a private investigator he had hired months ago. The investigator had been looking into David's background, searching for anything that could be used to his advantage. Mr. Graham had forgotten about the investigation, but the news he received that day changed everything. The investigator had found something, a secret from David's past that could ruin his career, something that could give Mr. Graham the leverage he needed to finally get what he wanted. As Mr. Graham hung up the phone, a plan began to form in his mind. He knew that he had promised to leave David and Emily alone, but this was different. This was an opportunity to turn the tables, to finally have the upper hand. And so, with a new determination, Mr. Graham set his plan into motion, knowing that this time he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. But little did he know, David and Emily were stronger than ever. They had faced the worst and come out on top, and they weren't about to let anyone, especially Mr. Graham, tear them apart. In the end, it was a battle of wills, a test of love and loyalty. And while Mr. Graham may have had power and influence, David and Emily had something far more valuable, a love that could withstand anything, even the most dangerous of obsessions. As the final chapter of their story unfolded, it became clear that the true power didn't lie in wealth or status, but in the strength of their bond, a bond that no one, not even Mr. Graham, could break. And so, the story ended, not with a victory for the powerful, but with a triumph for love, a love that had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious. Thank you for being a part of Narrative Stories. Your support and engagement mean the world to us. We are committed to bringing you the best in storytelling. What kinds of stories would you like to see next? Share your thoughts in the comments below.